Welcome to this immersive journey through time. Before we begin our descent into the emerald shadows of the past, if you find peace, wonder, or wisdom in these stories, please consider hitting the like button, subscribing to our channel, and leaving a comment below. It costs you nothing, but it truly helps our channel grow and allows us to keep bringing these lost worlds back to life for you. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let the sounds of the ancient jungle carry you away. Part 1. The Breath of the Chamber. The Awakening of the Corn. In the beginning, there was only a profound, heavy silence. Imagine a world without the rustle of a leaf, without the chirp of a cricket, without even the heartbeat of a single living thing. There was only the sky, vast and empty, and the sea, dark and coiled like a sleeping serpent. In this indigo void lived the creators, Tapu and Cucumats, the heart of sky and the heart of earth. They were draped in the shimmering feathers of the Quetzal bird, glowing with a soft, ethereal light in the darkness of the primordial waters. They spoke, and their words were the first seeds of reality. When they said earth, the land rose like a great green turtle from the mist. When they said mountains, the peaks pierced the clouds. They carpeted the world in cedar, mahogany, and palm, filling the air with the scent of damp moss and blooming orchids. But as they looked upon their creation, a loneliness settled over them. They wanted to be remembered. They wanted to be thanked. They wanted a voice to sing their praises and a heart to keep the count of the days. First, they created the animals of the forest. They gave the jaguar its spots and the deer its speed. But when the gods asked to be named, the jaguar could only growl, and the birds could only twitter and scream. These creatures had voices, but no language. They had life, but no soul that could comprehend the divine. Disappointed but not defeated, the gods moved to their second attempt. They gathered the damp red clay of the riverbanks and fashioned figures in the shape of humans. But these clay people were a failure. In the humid heat of the jungle, they remained soft and limp. When the rains came, their faces melted away, and they crumbled back into the mud from which they were born. They were blind, and their minds were as hollow as a broken jar. So, the creators turned to wood. They carved men from the yellow cedar and women from the rushes of the marsh. These wooden people were a vast improvement. They walked, they talked, and they began to populate the earth. They built small huts and fires, and they spoke to one another in clear, rhythmic voices. But as the gods watched them, they realized something was missing. The wooden people had no K, no sacred essence. Their hearts were dry as kindling, and their memories were shorter than the shadow of a noon sun. They forgot who had carved them. They treated the world with cruelty, beating their dogs and burning their cooking pots without a second thought. In a divine fury, the heart of sky sent a great flood, a rain of thick black resin that turned the day into night. The very tools and animals the wooden people had mistreated rose up against them. "You burned us," cried the cooking pots. "You starved us," barked the dogs. The wooden people tried to flee into the trees, but they were hunted down until only a few remained. Those survivors were turned into monkeys, left to chatter in the canopy as a permanent reminder of the gods' second failure. The world fell silent once more, save for the mocking laughter of the monkeys. But then, 4 animals, the mountain cat, the coyote, the parrot, and the crow, approached the creators. They spoke of a secret place called Paxil, the mountain of the divided water. Within this mountain, hidden behind walls of stone and mist, was a treasure, the yellow and white maize. The grandmother goddess, Mukon, the divine midwife of the universe, took this corn and ground it 9 times upon her stone metate. She mixed the flour with the clear water of life creating a rich golden dough. From this dough, she fashioned the flesh of 4 men: Balaam Quitze, Balaam Akab, Mahukuta, and Akai Balaam. These were the first true humans, the people of the corn. When they opened their eyes, they did not just see the world, they understood it. Their vision was so powerful that they could see through mountains and to the very edge of the cosmos. They thanked the creators with such profound wisdom that the gods grew uneasy. "They are too much like us," the heart of sky whispered. "If they see everything, they will believe they are gods themselves." So, the heart of sky leaned down and blew a mist into their eyes, like breath on a mirror. Their vision became blurred, limited to what was close at hand. This was the great compromise. The Maya were given the wisdom to understand the divine, but the humility to know they were mortal. These first families wandered out into the lush lowlands of the Petén and the mist-covered highlands of the south. They looked at the world and saw it not as a wilderness to be conquered, but as a living, breathing organism. At the center of their universe stood the Waka Chan, the great saber tree. Its massive, buttressed roots reached down into the 9 dark levels of Xibalba, the place of fright. Its trunk was the world of men, and its branches supported the 13 levels of the celestial heavens. To live as a person of the corn meant to live in a state of constant reciprocity with the earth. The Maya understood that if you take from the land, you must give back. This philosophy birthed the milpa, the sacred garden. They did not plant in rows of a single crop. Instead, they planted the 3 sisters. First came the maize, the tall golden backbone of the field. Then came the beans, which climbed the stalks of the corn, fixing nitrogen into the soil to keep it fertile. Finally, they planted the squash, whose broad, prickly leaves carpeted the ground, acting as a living mulch that trapped moisture and choked out weeds. It was a perfect, self-sustaining ecosystem, a reflection of the balance the gods intended for the world. As the population grew, the humble villages of thatch and mud began to transform. In the pre-classic era, around 1000 BCE, the Maya began to move stone. They discovered that the limestone beneath their feet was a miracle material. When freshly quarried, it was soft enough to be carved with flint chisels. When exposed to the air, it hardened into a permanent monument. They learned to burn limestone to create a brilliant white plaster, which they mixed with the juice of the morning glory vine to create a durable, waterproof cement. Deep in the Mirador Basin, the first giants began to stir. Cities like Nakbe and the colossal El Mirador rose above the jungle canopy. Imagine standing in the year 200 BCE, looking out over a sea of emerald leaves. Emerging from the green are pyramids so massive they look like mountains. The greatest of these, Ladanta, was one of the largest structures ever built by human hands. These weren't just buildings, they were water mountains, wits. Their steep sides were designed to funnel every drop of tropical rain into massive, stucco-lined reservoirs, ensuring the people could survive the long dry seasons. The pyramids were painted in a red, so deep and vibrant it pulsed like a heartbeat. On their sides, artists fashioned massive stucco masks of the sun god Kinich Adjo and the principal bird deity. The air in these early cities would have been thick with the smell of wood smoke, roasting corn, and the sharp tang of lime dust. You would hear the constant chink 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 of stone on stone as thousands of laborers worked to realize the visions of their leaders. But these were not yet the warring kingdoms of the later years. This was an era of shared cosmic vision. The Maya were obsessed with time. They realized that the stars were not just lights in the sky, but the white road, the Milky Way, leading to the ancestral home. They began to track the movements of the planets with a precision that would not be matched in Europe for another 1,000 years. They understood that time was not a line leading toward an end, but a series of interlocking circles. Just as the corn is planted, grows, dies, and is reborn from its own seed, so too did the Maya believe that the ages of the world would repeat. They created the long count calendar, a system of tracking time from a mythical starting point in the year 3114 BCE. This allowed them to record history over thousands of years, anchoring their lives in the deep time of the universe. For the Maya, to know the date was to know the character of the day, whether it was a day for planting, a day for war, or a day for quiet reflection. As the sun began to set on this early, formative era, the stage was set for the arrival of the great Holy Lords. The humble farmers were becoming a civilization of architects, astronomers, and poets. The jungle was no longer a barrier, it was a canvas. But as the cities grew larger and the pyramids taller, the demands of the gods and the egos of men began to change. The era of the divine kings was dawning, and with it a brilliance that would light up the world, and a shadow that would eventually consume it. As the mists of the pre-classic era began to lift, the world of the Maya transformed from a collection of scattered farming villages into a constellation of glittering stone superpowers. We have entered the classic period, the golden noon of this civilization, spanning from roughly 250 to 900 AD. This was a time when the jungle did not just harbor life, it pulsed with the rhythm of 1,000,000 human hearts, all governed by the movements of the stars and the commands of the Kual Ajo, the divine kings. Close your eyes and imagine waking up in the city of Tikal at the height of its glory. The air is cool and heavy with the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine. Before the sun even touches the horizon, the city is already breathing. From the thatched roofs of the commoners' quarters on the outskirts, thin ribbons of blue wood smoke rise into the canopy as families prepare their first meal of the day. Thick, hand-pressed corn tortillas and bowls of black beans seasoned with wild chili peppers. But as you move toward the center of the city, the world changes. The narrow forest paths broaden into wide, white-plastered causeways called sakbiob, or white roads. These were the arteries of the empire, elevated above the swampy ground, so that even in the height of the rainy season, the king's messengers and the merchant caravans could travel unimpeded. As the sun finally crests the tree line, it hits the great plaza, and for a moment, the world is blinding. The pyramids were not the grey-weathered stones we see today. In their prime, they were covered in smooth, polished lime plaster and painted in a palette of vibrant, symbolic colors. The most dominant was Maya red, a deep, earthy crimson made from hematite or cinnabar, representing the life force of blood and the heat of the rising sun. Contrasting this were accents of Maya blue, a miraculous pigment created by fusing indigo and a rare clay, a color so durable it has survived 1,000 years of tropical decay. This blue represented the sky, the cooling rains, and the sacred waters of the underworld. At the summit of these water mountains, the temples sat like stone crowns. Here, the Kual Ajo lived and ruled. To the Maya, the king was not merely a political leader. He was a literal axis between worlds. He was the world tree made flesh. When he walked, the jade ornaments on his belt and wrists clinked like the sound of falling rain, a sacred music that reminded the people of his power to command the elements. His headdress was a towering masterpiece of iridescent green quetzal feathers, flowing behind him like the tail of a celestial serpent. To be a king was a heavy burden. He was the guardian of time itself. The Maya believed that the universe was a fragile mechanism that required constant maintenance. If the king did not perform the correct rituals at the precise moment dictated by the stars, the sun might not rise, or the rains might turn to dust. In the quiet sanctuaries atop the pyramids, surrounded by the swirling smoke of copal incense, a sweet, resinous scent that the Maya called the brain of the sky, the king would consult his scribes and astronomers. The Maya scribes were the masters of the hidden speech. They developed the most sophisticated writing system in the Americas, a complex web of over 800 glyphs that combined pictures with sounds. They did not just record history, they turned stone into poetry. On massive limestone pillars called stelae, which they referred to as titun or stone trees, they carved the biographies of their lords, the dates of their victories, and the lineages of their queens. They wrote on paper made from the inner bark of wild fig trees, coated in white lime, and folded like an accordion into books called codices. These books were the libraries of the universe, containing everything from agricultural almanacs to tables that predicted lunar eclipses with a precision that would baffle modern scientists. Tragically, most of these were lost to time and fire, but the stone trees still stand in the jungle, their silent voices waiting for those who know how to listen. While the kings studied the heavens, the life of the people centered on the great marketplaces. Imagine the sensory overload of a Maya market. It was a place of vibrant commerce and social theater. There was no metal currency here. Instead, wealth was measured in the currency of the gods. Cacao beans, the seeds from which chocolate is made, were used as small change. A handful of beans could buy a rabbit. A few hundred could buy a finely woven cloak. You would see merchants from the highlands of Guatemala offering obsidian, the volcanic glass as sharp as a modern scalpel, which was used for everything from kitchen knives to the king's ritual blades. You would see traders from the coasts with sacks of sea salt and dried fish, and artisans from the lowlands showing off delicate pottery painted with scenes of dancing gods and underworld monsters. And then there was the chocolate. To the Maya, cacao was more than food. It was a sacred bridge to the divine. It was rarely eaten as a solid bar. Instead, it was prepared as a frothy, bitter beverage. The beans were roasted, ground into a paste, and mixed with water, cornmeal, and chili peppers. A skilled pourer would hold the vessel high above her head, cascading the liquid into a second bowl to create a thick, velvety foam, the spirit of the drink. To the Maya, the foam was the most precious part, a physical representation of the breath of life. The Maya were also masters of the hidden zero. In their mathematics, they used a system of dots and bars, a dot for 1, a bar for 5. But their true genius lay in the invention of the zero, represented by a stylized shell. This allowed them to calculate into the millions and to understand the concept of nothingness as a starting point for everything. With this tool, they built their calendars. They lived by 2 interlocking clocks. The Tzolkin, a sacred calendar of 260 days, governed the spiritual life and the naming of children. The Harb, a solar calendar of 365 days, tracked the seasons and the agricultural cycles. When these two wheels aligned every 52 years, it marked a calendar round, a time of great anxiety and renewal, where the world was seen as being reborn. But life in the Golden Age was not all science and chocolate. As the cities grew more crowded, the competition for resources became fierce. The great superpowers, cities like Tikal and its bitter rival Calakmul, began to eye each other across the jungle. The Star Wars era was beginning, where battles were timed to the movements of Venus, the great star of war. The peaceful farmers, who once cleared the jungle, were now being called to serve as warriors, carrying shields of jaguar skin and spears tipped with obsidian. As the afternoon sun begins to dip below the horizon of our story, the shadows of the pyramids grow long and thin. The cities are at their peak, their populations swelling into the tens of thousands. The stone is bright, the granaries are full, and the kings seem invincible. But in the silence of the deep jungle, the first cracks are beginning to form. The very success of the people of the Corn, their massive monuments, their endless wars and their growing hunger, is putting a strain on the earth that even the most powerful Kuala might not be able to fix. The gods are watching, and they are beginning to grow thirsty. As the golden light of the Classic Age deepened, the Maya world became a theatre of the divine. To the people of the Corn, the physical world was merely a thin crust, a fragile membrane stretched over a vast, swirling ocean of spiritual energy. To live was to walk a tightrope between the celestial heights and the watery depths of the abyss. This was a world where every action, from the planting of a seed to the coronation of a king, was a ritual act designed to keep the great cycle of time from grinding to a halt. To understand the soul of the Maya, one must look toward the shadows, specifically the shadows of the cenotes. In the limestone shelf of the Yucatan and the deep basins of the south, the earth occasionally collapses, revealing hidden subterranean pools of crystal-clear water. To the modern eye, they are wonders of nature. To the Maya, they were the mouths of Xibalba, the place of fright. This was the nine-leveled underworld, a place of cold mists, skeletal gods, and tests of courage. It was not a hell in the sense of punishment, but a place of transformation and origin. It was the womb of the earth from which the sun emerged every morning, and where it returned every night to battle the lords of death. The journey through the afterlife was a harrowing odyssey that every soul, from the lowliest farmer to the highest queen, had to navigate. It was said that the dead had to cross a river of blood and a river of pus, evade the house of bats, where giant winged creatures sought to decapitate the unwary, and survive the house of cold and the house of knives. Only by outmarrying the lords of death, as the hero twins, Hunahpu and Xbalanque, had done in the myths of the Popol Vuh, could a soul be reborn as a star in the night sky. Because the path was so treacherous, the living felt a profound duty to assist the dead. But more importantly, they felt a duty to assist the gods. The Maya believed that the gods had sacrificed their own blood to create the world, and like any great debt, this blood mortgage had to be repaid with interest. This is the origin of the ritual that often shocks the modern mind, the sacred act of bloodletting. In the private sanctuaries of the palaces, beneath the gaze of smoke-stained idols, the Kuala and his consort would prepare for the ultimate communion. This was not an act of cruelty, but one of extreme devotion and political necessity. A king who would not bleed for his people was a king who could not lead them. Using stingray spines, obsidian lancets, or sharp blades of flint, the royalty would pierce their own flesh, the tongue, the ears, or the skin. They would draw the blood onto strips of bark paper, which were then placed in ceramic braziers and set aflame. As the thick, pungent smoke of blood and copal rose toward the vaulted ceiling, the participants would enter a trance state, likely aided by the extreme pain and the use of ritual substances like fermented honey or sacred mushrooms. Within the swirling smoke, they would witness the vision serpent, a colossal, multi-headed entity that served as a telephone line to the ancestors. Through the mouth of the serpent, a long-dead grandfather or a founding deity would speak, offering guidance on war, marriage, or the coming of the rains. To the Maya, this was the highest form of science. the direct observation of the invisible laws that governed their lives. But the most public and visceral manifestation of this cosmic struggle took place in the ball court. Nearly every Maya city, from the smallest outpost to the sprawling plazas of Chichen Itza, centered around a long, eye-shaped arena with sloping stone walls. This was the site of pits, the Maya ball game. Imagine the atmosphere. The stands are packed with thousands of spectators, their bodies painted in brilliant colors, the air vibrating with the sound of wooden trumpets and turtle-shell drums. On the court, two teams of elite athletes face each other. They wear heavy leather padding around their waists, knees, and forearms. For the ball they use is a solid, heavy sphere of raw rubber. In an age before synthetic materials, this rubber ball was a miracle, a dense, chaotic object that moved with a life of its own, bouncing with lethal force. The rules were grueling. Players could not use their hands or feet. They had to keep the ball in motion using only their hips, elbows, and shoulders. The ball represented the sun itself, and the court was the dark rift of the Milky Way. Every pass, every save, and every strike was a reenactment of the hero twins' victory over the Lords of Death. It was a game of incredible grace and brutal impact. A single blow from the heavy ball to the chest could be fatal. In some ritual games, the stakes were even higher. The captain of the losing team, or sometimes, in a paradox of Maya thought, the winning team, would be offered as a sacrifice to the gods. To the Maya, being chosen for sacrifice was not a punishment. It was a shortcut to divinity. It was a way to bypass the terrors of Xibalba and go straight to the side of the sun god. The blood spilled on the ball court was the water that nourished the world, ensuring that the sun would continue its journey and the corn would continue to grow. This obsession with balance extended to their view of the natural world. They did not see themselves as masters of nature, but as participants in a delicate negotiation. When a hunter killed a deer, he whispered a prayer of apology to the Lord of the Animals, explaining that his family was hungry and promising that his own body would one day return to the soil to feed the forest. When a farmer cleared a patch of jungle, he made offerings to the spirits of the trees, asking permission to disturb the green silence. Everything had a chulel, a soul. The stones of the temple, the water in the cenote, the wind that heralded the storm, all were alive, and all were demanding. This made the Maya world incredibly vibrant, but also incredibly intense. There was no such thing as a random event. A drought wasn't just a weather pattern, it was a sign that the gods were displeased. A victory in battle wasn't just a matter of tactics, it was proof that the king's blood covenant was strong. As we look closer at these rituals, we see a people who lived with an awareness of the deep time. They didn't just worry about the next harvest, they worried about the next millennium. They recorded the dates of mythological events that happened millions of years in the past and projected their calendars thousands of years into the future. They were the librarians of the soul, meticulously documenting the heartbeat of the universe. But even as the smoke of the copal rose and the rubber ball thudded against the stone walls, the physical world was changing. The very rituals that bound the people together were becoming more frequent and more desperate. The kings were building larger and larger temples to appease the gods, demanding more labor and more resources from a land that was beginning to show signs of exhaustion. The beauty of the classic Maya was like a flower in full bloom, stunning, complex, and seemingly eternal. But the petals were beginning to feel the first dry breeze of a coming season. The rituals were growing louder, the bloodletting more frequent, as if by the sheer force of their will, the Maya could hold back the shifting tides of the earth. Night is falling on the ball court now. The the cheers of the crowd have faded into the sound of the evening cicadas. The king has retreated to his inner chamber, his wounds bound in cotton, his mind still reeling from the visions in the smoke. The universe is safe for another day. But as the moon rises over the jungle, it reflects in the still, dark water of a cenote, a reminder that while men may build mountains of stone, the roots of the underworld are patient, and the hunger of the gods is never truly satisfied. While the kings bled and the astronomers watched the stars, the true miracle of the Maya civilization was happening on a much humbler level, in the dirt, under the fingernails of the commoners, and over the hearth fires of millions of homes. To understand how a civilization of tens of millions thrived in the middle of a tropical rainforest, a landscape that can be as unforgiving as it is beautiful, we must look at what they ate. For the Maya, food was not just sustenance, it was the very fabric of their identity. Imagine the dawn in a typical Maya village on the outskirts of a great city like Copan. The first sound you hear isn't the temple trumpet, but the rhythmic shuck 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 of a stone mino grinding corn against a metate. This sound was the heartbeat of the Maya world. Every morning for thousands of years, women performed this labor, turning dried kernels of maize into the lifeblood of their people. But this wasn't just any corn. The Maya had mastered a chemical process that was thousands of years ahead of its time, a process we now call nixtamalization. They would soak the dried corn in an alkaline solution, usually water mixed with lime or wood ash. This didn't just make the corn easier to grind, it unlocked essential B vitamins and amino acids that are otherwise trapped inside the kernel. Without this secret knowledge, the Maya would have suffered from malnutrition. With it, they became the people of the corn, built on a foundation of nutritional genius. As the sun climbed higher, the men and older children would head to the milpa. The milpa was far more than a farm. It was a sacred, polycultural garden that mimicked the diversity of the jungle itself. At its heart were the three sisters: maize, beans, and squash. The maize was the eldest sister, providing a strong, vertical stalk for the others to lean on. The beans were the second sister. They climbed the corn stalks, and in return for the support, they fixed nitrogen into the soil, acting as a natural fertilizer to keep the land productive year after year. The squash was the third sister. Her broad, prickly leaves spread across the ground like a living carpet. This carpet served three purposes. It shaded the soil to keep it moist in the tropical heat. It acted as a natural weed suppressant, and its tiny prickles discouraged pests. Together, these three plants provided a complete protein and a balanced diet. But the Maya didn't stop there. Their gardens were a riot of biodiversity. Interspersed among the corn were chili peppers of every heat and flavor, tomatoes, sweet potatoes, and jicama. They grew sunflowers for their seeds and cotton for their clothing. They didn't just clear the forest, they managed it. They planted fruit trees, papaya, avocado, and guava, around their homes, creating forest gardens that provided food, shade, and medicine all at once. If you were to sit down for a midday meal in a Maya household, the air would be thick with the smell of roasting earth. You might be served tamales, but not necessarily the ones we know today. Ancient tamales were often large, dense cakes of corn dough, filled with anything from toasted squash seeds to deer meat or iguana, wrapped in large waxy leaves and steamed in underground pits. You would certainly have a bowl of atoll, a thick, warm corn drink sweetened with wild honey or spiced with chilies. And then there was the forest's greatest gift, the cacao. While the elite drank it frothed and bitter in porcelain vessels, the common people also enjoyed it, though perhaps in a simpler form. They understood that the cacao tree, which grows in the shade of taller forest giants, was a gift from the gods. They used the pods not just for drink, but as a form of currency. Imagine a world where money literally grew on trees. A pumpkin might cost 4 cacao beans. A high-quality cotton cloak might cost 100. This edible economy kept the Maya world connected, as trade routes for cacao stretched from the deep southern jungles all the way to the dry northern coasts. But feeding millions in a rainforest required more than just clever gardening. As the cities grew into metropolises, the Maya became masters of landscape engineering. In the low-lying, swampy areas known as barrios, they built raised fields. They would dig out muck from the bottom of the swamps and pile it up into long rectangular platforms. This served a dual purpose. It drained the swamp so crops wouldn't rot, and the muck they piled up was incredibly fertile, packed with organic nutrients. These fields were so productive they could yield 2 or even 3 harvests a year. In the hilly regions, they carved massive stone terraces into the mountainsides, preventing erosion and creating flat strips of land for planting. They built water mountains, temples and plazas designed to catch the torrential rains of the summer and funnel them into massive, lime-lined reservoirs. Some of these reservoirs were so large they could hold enough water to sustain a city of 60,000 people through a 6-month drought. They even used sand and minerals to filter their water, creating some of the world's first large-scale water purification systems. The Maya diet was also supplemented by the animals they shared the forest with. They were expert hunters, using blowguns and traps to catch turkeys, peccaries, wild pigs, and tapirs. In the coastal regions, they were master fishermen, harvesting stingrays, manatees, and enormous quantities of shellfish. They even managed wild populations. They would leave certain areas of the forest untouched to ensure that the deer and turkeys had a safe place to breed, ensuring a permanent supply of protein. As you walk through the marketplace of a city like Tikal or Karakol, you would see the incredible variety this system produced. You would see piles of bright red chilies, baskets of shimmering green avocados, and stacks of dried salt from the northern flats of the Yucatan. You would hear the haggling of merchants and the laughter of children playing with clay whistles. But there was a shadow beginning to creep over this abundance. The Maya system of slash and burn agriculture, where a patch of forest is burned to clear it, planted for a few years, and then left to rest, worked perfectly for small populations. But as the Holy Lords demanded more and more food to feed their armies and their builders, the land was given less time to rest. The forests were being pushed back further and further. The 3 sisters were being asked to do the impossible, to feed a population that was doubling every few generations. For now, however, the granaries are full. The smell of roasting corn still fills the evening air, and the people are strong. They believe that as long as they honor the maize and keep the count of the days, the earth will continue to provide. They don't yet know that the climate is shifting, or that the very soil they tread upon is beginning to thin. Tonight, the village is quiet. The fires have burned down to glowing embers. A mother hums a song to her child, a song about the first humans made of dough, while the smoke of the hearth rises to join the mist of the jungle. The people of the corn are at the height of their strength, unaware that the great cycle is turning toward a time of thirst. The jungle was no longer a silent witness to the growth of the people of the corn. By the middle of the Classic Age, the canopy trembled under the weight of stone and the echoes of names that were meant to last forever. We have reached the era of the great superpowers, a time when the Maya world was not a single empire, but a fractured, brilliant, and terrifying chessboard of warring city-states. At the center of this chessboard sat the cool Arja, the Holy Lords, Men who believed their blood was the ichor of the gods and whose egos were carved into the very face of the earth. To understand the peak of this civilization, you must visualize two towering giants staring at each other across the emerald sea of the Petun Basin. To the south stood Tikal, the city of the Mughal dynasty, famous for its steep, sky-piercing pyramids that look like stone fingers reaching for the throat of the heavens. To the north sat Calakmul, the seat of the Karnal, or the Snake Kings. If Tikal was the city of soaring height, Calakmul was the city of massive, sprawling weight, boasting some of the largest pyramids ever constructed in the ancient world. These two cities were the poles of the Maya universe. Every other city, Palenque, Copan, Caracol, Dos Pilas, was a piece in their game. This was an age of Star Wars, not fought in the vacuum of space, but timed to the movements of the planet Venus. When the great star appeared in a specific position in the sky, it was a signal that the gods demanded a harvest of captives. War was not a chaotic brawl. It was a choreographed ritual of prestige. The goal was rarely to burn a city to the ground, but to capture the rival king, to strip him of his jade and his dignity, and to bring him back to the victor's plaza to prove whose blood covenant with the gods was stronger. Step into the sandals of a young prince in the city of Tikal during this era. Your life is defined by the bundle. Since your birth, you have been told that you are the keeper of the ancestral spirits, wrapped in sacred cloth and hidden in the dark recesses of the palace. Your education is not just in the arts of the spear and the shield, but in the complex mathematics of the stars. You must learn to read the stone trees, the stelae that line the plaza, because to be a king is to be a master of memory. If you forget the date of your great-grandfather's victory, you lose your right to the throne. The coronation of such a king was a spectacle that could last for weeks. Imagine the great plaza of Tikal, packed with 50,000 people, their brown skin shimmering with sweat and red cinnabar paint. The king emerges from the dark doorway of the temple, high above the crowd. He is draped in hundreds of pounds of jade, the stone of life, the color of corn and water. Around his waist is a belt of carved shells and human bone, and on his head is the towering crown of quetzal feathers, shimmering iridescent green and gold in the tropical sun. When he moves, he does not move as a man. He moves as the axis mundi, the center point of the four directions. But behind this mask of divine power was a world of brutal politics. The Snake Kings of Calakmul were masters of the long game. Rather than attacking Tikal directly, they began to weave a web of alliances, like a spider encircling its prey. They used marriage as a weapon. They would send a princess from the Snake dynasty to marry a minor lord in a city near Tikal, turning that city into a vassal state. Slowly, Tikal found itself surrounded. The trade routes for salt, obsidian, and quetzal feathers were being choked off. In the year 562 AD, the trap snapped shut. The Snake Kings and their allies launched a coordinated star war against Tikal. The city was defeated, its king likely sacrificed, and for the next 130 years, Tikal fell into a hiatus. No new monuments were built. No history was carved into stone. The jungle began to creep back into the Great Plaza, and it seemed as though the Jaguar dynasty had been erased from time itself. Yet, this period of silence in Tikal allowed other flowers of the Maya world to bloom in spectacular, unique ways. To the west, in the mist-shrouded foothills of the Chiapas Mountains, the city of Palenque rose to its greatest glory under the reign of Kainik Yanab Pakal, also known as Pakal the Great. Pakal took the throne when he was only 12 years old and ruled for 68 years. He was an architect of the soul. Under his reign, Palenque became a masterpiece of delicate, refined beauty. While other cities built blocky, massive structures, Pakal's architects created temples with roof combs that looked like stone lace. But his greatest legacy lay beneath the earth. Deep within the Temple of the Inscriptions, Pakal built his own tomb, a feat of engineering that wouldn't be discovered by modern archaeologists until 1952. To reach him, one had to descend a secret, humid staircase spiraling down into the heart of the pyramid. There, Pakal lay in a massive stone sarcophagus, his face covered in a mask of 1,000 pieces of jade. The lid of his sarcophagus is perhaps the most famous piece of Maya art in existence. It depicts Pakal at the moment of his death, falling into the jaws of the underworld, but also being reborn as the world tree, rising through the center of the cosmos. It was a statement of eternal life, a claim that even in death, the king was the engine that kept the universe turning. Further to the southeast, the city of Copan became the Athens of the Maya world. Here, the stone was soft and greenish, allowing sculptors to create three-dimensional statues that seemed to breathe. The kings of Copan were obsessed with the prestige of history. They built the hieroglyphic stairway, a massive flight of steps where every single stone is a glyph, telling the entire history of the dynasty. It is the longest stone text in the Americas, a literal staircase of memory. But as the 7th century drew to a close, the silence in Tikal was broken. A new king arose, Jesor Chan Kawila I. He was a man possessed by the need to restore the honor of the jaguar. He didn't just rebuild the city, he reimagined it. He commissioned Temple Vof and Temple II, the iconic steep pyramids that face each other across the Great Plaza like two warriors in eternal conversation. In 695 AD, Jesor Chan Kawil turned the tables on the Snake Kings. He led his army into the heart of the Calakmul territory and won a decisive victory. He captured the sacred effigy of the Snake King, a physical manifestation of their god, and brought it back to Tikal in triumph. This victory didn't just win a war, it shifted the gravity of the Maya world back to the south. The era that followed was the Late Classic, the most opulent and crowded time in Maya history. The cities were now larger than many European cities of the same time. Every inch of the landscape was being used. The hills were terraced, the swamps were drained, and the forests were being cleared at a terrifying rate to provide the fuel needed to burn limestone into the plaster that covered the ever-growing temples. The rivalry between the superpowers had created a monumental arms race. If Tikal built a temple 70 meters high, Calakmul would try to build one 75 meters high. If Palenque carved a beautiful tablet, Copan would carve a more intricate stela. This competition drove the Maya to the absolute heights of artistic and scientific achievement, but it also sowed the seeds of their vulnerability. The Holy Lords were now so far removed from the common people that they lived in a world of pure ritual. They spent their days in bloodletting ceremonies and their nights tracking the stars, while the farmers below were beginning to notice that soil was getting thinner. The rains were becoming less predictable. The three sisters, the corn, beans, and squash, were being asked to feed a population that had grown beyond the land's capacity to sustain it. But for a moment, let us linger in this golden noon. Imagine the sight of 1,000 torches reflecting off the red-painted walls of Tikal. Hear the sound of the king's jade jewelry clinking as he dances on the summit of Temple I, a green-feathered god against the purple sky of dusk. The Maya world is a masterpiece of stone and spirit, a civilization that has mastered time, language, and the very stars themselves. The kings believe they have conquered death. They believe their names will be spoken as long as the sun rises. They do not yet see that the great cycle they so carefully tracked is beginning to turn toward a cold, dry shadow. The superpowers are at the height of their brilliance, but the very stone that made them immortal is about to become their tomb. As the fires of the celebration burn low, the jungle waits. The roots of the saber are patient. They have seen the rise of the wooden people and the clay people, and they know that even the people of the corn must eventually return to the earth. But for tonight, the jaguar is king, and the world is a symphony of red stone and green feathers. As the 7th century turned into the 8th, the emerald silence of the jungle was increasingly shattered by the sounds of the shield and the flint. This was the Maya term for war, and it was becoming the heartbeat of their existence. While we often think of the Maya as peaceful astronomers, the truth is more complex, more visceral, and far more dramatic. To the people of the corn, war was not an accident of politics. It was a cosmic necessity, a ritual performed on a grand, terrifying scale. In the Maya world, the movements of the heavens did not just predict the future, they commanded it. And no celestial body was more feared or more followed than the great star, the planet we know as Venus. While we associate Venus with love and beauty, the Maya saw her as a celestial warrior, a harbinger of blood and conquest. When Venus rose as the morning star, it was as if a divine bell had been struck. The kings and their generals would look to the horizon, not with wonder, but with a cold, calculated readiness. This was the era of Star Wars, military campaigns, timed with mathematical precision to coincide with the movements of Venus and Jupiter. Imagine the atmosphere in the barracks of a city like Dos Pilas or Caracol. These were not peasant militias. These were elite warrior societies. The warriors did not wear metal, for the Maya lived in a Stone Age world of incredible sophistication. Instead, they wore padded armor, thick quilted tunics of cotton that had been soaked in salt water until they were as hard and protective as modern Kevlar. Over this, they draped the skins of jaguars, believing that by wearing the pelt, they inherited the spirit and the killing grace of the great feline god. Their weapons were masterpieces of lethal art. They carried spears tipped with flint as sharp as a razor, and clubs embedded with blades of obsidian, volcanic glass that can be honed to an edge far thinner than any steel scalpel. They carried shields of toughened hide, painted with the terrifying faces of underworld demons designed to paralyze their enemies with fear. To go to war was to step out of the mundane world and into a living myth. But the goal of these Star Wars was rarely the total destruction of a city. The Maya were far more interested in the currency of the soul. The true prize was the capture of high-ranking nobles, and the ultimate trophy was the Koa Ajor, the Holy Lord himself. To capture a king was to strip a city of its spiritual anchor. It was the ultimate demonstration that your gods were stronger, your blood was purer, and your right to rule was absolute. Picture the scene of a royal capture. In the heat of a jungle ambush, the rival king is not killed, but surrounded. His jade ornaments are torn from his neck. His towering headdress of quetzal feathers is trampled into the mud. He is bound with rough ropes, his dignity replaced by the cold reality of a captive's fate. As he is marched back to the victor's city, the common people line the white causeways, not to jeer, but to witness a god in decline. For the captured king, the journey was not just a physical one. It was a slow descent into Xibalba, the underworld, while he was still breathing. Back in the Great Plaza, the atmosphere would be electric. The victors would celebrate with blood covenants and feasting. But for the captives, the ordeal was just beginning. They were often kept for years, treated with a mix of ritual respect and calculated humiliation. They might be forced to play the sacred ball game, but with the outcome already decided by the priests. A rigged game where the loser's life was the final wager. We must speak now of the ritual of sacrifice, for it is the part of Maya history that is most misunderstood. To our modern ears, it sounds like senseless cruelty, but to the Maya, it was a profound and somber duty. They believed that the universe was like a great machine that required constant lubrication to keep from seizing up. That lubricant was kick, the sacred essence of life found in the blood. If the gods did not receive the precious water, the sun would cease to move, the corn would wither in the fields, and the world would return to the dark, watery void from which it came. The sacrifice was a carefully choreographed drama. On the summit of the red-painted pyramids, under the gaze of the entire city, the captive would be stretched over a curved stone altar. The high priest, his face painted black and red, would use a blade of obsidian to open the chest, offering the still-beating heart to the sun. The blood would flow down the steep, narrow steps of the temple, steps designed specifically to channel the liquid in a crimson river, symbolizing the rain that the people so desperately craved. In these moments, the Maya believed the veil between worlds was at its thinnest. The smoke of the copal incense, the rhythmic chanting of the thousands below, and the final breath of the captive combined to create a portal. Through this portal, the gods were fed, the ancestors were honored, and the continuity of time was secured for another cycle. However, as we moved deeper into the 8th century, something in this system began to break. The Star Wars became more frequent. The sacrifices grew more numerous. It was as if the kings were trying to shout at the gods, but the gods were no longer answering. The political landscape was becoming a war of all against all. Smaller cities, once content to be vassals, were now rising up against their masters. The web of alliances that the snake kings of Calakmul had so carefully woven was fraying. The massive construction projects, the ever-taller pyramids and the sprawling palaces required an unthinkable amount of labor and resources. To make the plaster for a single large temple, thousands of acres of forest had to be cut down and burned to provide the heat necessary to process the limestone. The result was an ecological catastrophe of the Maya's own making. Without the trees to hold the soil, the tropical rains washed the nutrients away. Without the canopy to shade the earth, the temperature began to rise. The three sisters in the milpas were struggling. The cornstalks were shorter, the bean pods were empty. The kings responded the only way they knew how, with more ritual, more war, and more blood. They believed the drought was a punishment, so they increased the payment. But the more they fought, the more they diverted farmers into soldiers. The more they built, the more they exhausted the land. They were caught in a spiral of desperation. Imagine being a commoner in Tikal or Copan during this time. You look up at the Great Red Temple, and you see your king performing the ancient ceremonies. You see the blood spilled. You hear the prayers to the rain god, Chak, but the sky remains a hard, pitiless blue. For the first time in 1,000 years, the people began to doubt. If the Kuhol Adjo could not bring the rain, was he truly divine? If the stone trees of the ancestors could not protect the corn, were they worth the labor of building? The shadows on the altar were growing longer, and they were no longer just the shadows of the setting sun. They were the shadows of a civilization that had grown too large, too proud, and too hungry for its own heart. The great star of Venus continued to rise and set with mathematical perfection, but on the ground, the rhythm of the Maya world was beginning to falter. The Golden Age was not ending with a sudden bang, but with a long, agonizing hiss of escaping breath. The kings were still carving their names in stone, claiming eternal glory, even as their granaries stood empty. They were writing the final chapters of their greatness in a language of blood and obsidian, unaware that the jungle was already beginning to prepare its patient green embrace. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, listen for the sound of the distant drums. They are the drums of a world at its limit, a world that has mastered the stars but forgotten the soil. The people of the corn are facing their greatest test, and the 9 levels of Xibalba are waiting to see if they will emerge into the light or be swallowed by the dark. The sun that once blessed the people of the corn had turned into a relentless golden eye that would not blink. We are entering the late 8th and early 9th centuries, a period of Maya history that is often whispered about with a sense of tragedy. This was the era of the Great Thirst, the moment when the mathematical perfection of the calendars met the harsh physical limits of the earth. The water mountains, those magnificent pyramids designed to catch and hold the life-giving rains, were beginning to stand empty, their lime-plastered basins cracking under a sky that had forgotten how to weep. To understand the collapse of the classic Maya, we must look past the stories of warfare and into the very soil. For centuries, the Maya had been the ultimate engineers of the tropical forest. They had transformed swamps into gardens and hillsides into terraces, but their success had created a trap. The population had swelled to its breaking point. Some estimates suggest that in the southern lowlands there were as many as 200 people per square kilometer. To feed these millions, the 3 sisters were being forced to grow in soil that was tired, thin, and depleted of the nutrients it needed to sustain life. Science now tells us, through the study of stalagmites in caves and sediment layers in the Great Blue Hole, that the Maya heartland was hit by a series of devastating mega-droughts. This wasn't just a few dry seasons, it was a century-long shift in the climate. The intertropical convergence zone, the belt of clouds that brings the summer rains, had shifted its position. For a civilization built entirely on the rhythm of the rains, this was the equivalent of the sun failing to rise. Imagine you are a mother in a village near the great city of Karakol. You wake up before the sun, as you always have, to grind the corn. But the bag of dried kernels in the corner of your hut is lighter than it was yesterday, and there is no harvest coming to refill it. You walk to the local reservoir, the heart of your community, but the water has retreated from the stone edges. What remains is a thick, green slurry, fouled by the heat and the lack of movement. Your children are lethargic, their bellies swollen not with food, but with the hunger that the Maya called the quiet jaguar. You look toward the center of the city, where the great red pyramids of the king loom over the trees. You see the smoke of the copal rising. You know that at this very moment, the Koalajo is piercing his flesh, offering his royal blood to Chak, the rain god with the lightning bolt axe. For generations, this covenant had worked. The king bled, and the rains fell. But now, the king's blood seemed to have lost its flavor for the gods. This was a crisis of faith as much as a crisis of food. The Maya king was not just a politician, he was a rainmaker. His right to rule was based on his ability to maintain the cosmic balance. As the drought stretched from years into decades, the social contract began to dissolve. If the king could not bring the water, if the stone trees of the ancestors could not protect the milpa, then why should the people continue to carry the heavy limestone blocks for his monuments? Why should they march into Star Wars to capture more nobles for a god who had clearly turned his back? The landscape itself was screaming. To fuel the great lime kilns, needed to create the plaster that made the cities shine, the Maya had deforested vast swaths of the jungle. Without the trees to act as a cooling blanket, The ground temperature rose even further, and the evapotranspiration that helps create local rain clouds was diminished. The Maya had inadvertently created a heat island effect. They had cleared the forest to build their version of paradise, and in doing so, they had invited the desert into the heart of the jungle. As the hunger grew, the Star Wars turned from ritualistic competitions of prestige into desperate wars for survival. Cities were no longer fighting for captives. They were fighting for the last remaining reservoirs and the few patches of fertile land that hadn't turned to dust. In the city of Dos Pilas, the desperation is etched into the archaeology. The people were so terrified of invasion that they tore down their own beautiful palaces and temples to build crude, defensive walls right through the middle of their plazas. They were living in a state of siege, not just from rival armies, but from the environment itself. The exquisite pottery and fine jade work of the Golden Age began to vanish, replaced by the utilitarian tools of a people who had no time for beauty, only for the grim business of staying alive. But the Maya did not vanish in a single night of fire and ash. The collapse was a slow, agonizing migration. It was a great silence that began in one city and spread like a shadow to the next. One by one, the great dynastic centers of the south began to go dark. The scribes at Tikal carved their last date into a stela in 879 AD. At Calakmul, the silence began even earlier. The kings, realizing their power was gone, were the first to flee, or were the first to be cast down by their own starving subjects. There are signs of peasant revolts, where the royal palaces were burned and the sacred thrones were smashed, not by foreign invaders, but by the very people who had once worshipped those who sat upon them. Imagine the last days of a city like Palenque. The royal family is gone. The priests have stopped the count of the days. The great plaza, once the vibrant heart of a superpower, is now quiet, save for the wind whistling through the empty galleries of the palace. A few families remain, squatting in the rooms of the nobles, cooking their meager meals over fires built on the polished floors. They wait for a rain that never comes, until finally, they too pack their few belongings, their grinding stones, their seeds, their clay pots, and they begin to walk. They walked away from the stone mountains. They walked away from the holy lords who had failed them. They headed towards the edges of the world, to the northern coast of the Yucatan, where the sea offered salt and fish, and to the highlands, where the mists still clung to the mountains. They were returning to the life of the small village, the life that had existed before the first pyramid was ever raised. The jungle, patient and relentless, began to move in. Within a generation, the white roads were covered in moss. Within a century, the roots of the saber and the strangler fig were prying apart the limestone blocks of the temples. The red paint faded, washed away by the occasional mocking storm. The massive stucco masks of the gods were overgrown with vines, their sightless eyes staring out at a forest that was reclaiming its own. The Maya had not gone extinct. The people of the corn were still very much alive. But the classic Maya, the civilization of the great city-states, the divine kings, and the monumental calendars, was passing into the realm of myth. The sun was setting on the south, and the great cycle was turning toward a new, different kind of life in the north. As you close your eyes tonight, imagine the sound of the jungle reclaiming the stone. It is not a sound of destruction, but of a long, deep breath. The earth is resting. The great thirst is a reminder that even the most brilliant of stars must eventually fade, and that the only thing more powerful than the will of a king is the memory of the soil. The Maya are moving, their footsteps echoing on the dry leaves, searching for a place where the water still flows and the corn can rise again. As the shadows lengthened over the dying cities of the south, a new light was beginning to flicker in the north. The Great Migration was not an end, but a transformation. The people of the Corn were leaving behind the hollowed-out shells of their water mountains in the Petun, carrying their gods, their calendars, and their seeds in woven baskets on their backs. They were heading toward the flat, sun-drenched limestone shelf of the Yucatan Peninsula, a land where there were no great rivers, but where the earth held a secret, cooling heart. In this northern landscape, survival depended on the cenote. Without the great lakes and rivers of the south, the Maya looked downward, into the throat of the limestone. These deep, natural wells were the only source of water in a land of dry scrub and low forest. Every new city in the north was anchored to a cenote, for to own the water was to own the future. As the refugees from the south merged with the local northern lineages, a new kind of Maya brilliance began to bloom. This was the post-classic era, a time of reinvention. The people did not simply rebuild the past, they evolved. Nowhere is this clearer than in the rolling hills of the Puuc region. Here, cities like Uxmal rose like dreams carved from honey-colored stone. The architecture of the north was different, more refined, more geometric, and focused on a new kind of beauty. Instead of the sheer, terrifying height of the Tikal pyramids, the buildings of Uxmal, such as the governor's palace, were long, horizontal masterpieces. They were covered in intricate stone mosaics that looked like woven cloth, a silent tribute to the weavers who had always been the backbone of Maya life. At Uxmal, the most prominent face you see carved into the stone is not a human king, but Chak, the rain god. His long hooked nose and terrifying fangs appear hundreds of times on the corners of the temples. In the dry north, the obsession with rain was no longer a royal ritual, it was a public prayer. The people were more practical now. They had seen the fall of the Holy Lords, and they placed their faith in the gods of the elements and the strength of their own communities. But the true giant of this era, the city that would come to define the new world of the Maya, was Chichen Itza. Imagine walking into Chichen Itza at its height, around the year 1000 AD. The air feels different here than in the old southern cities. It is more cosmopolitan, more vibrant, and perhaps a bit more dangerous. There is a new spirit in the air, the spirit of the plumed serpent, known to the Maya as Kukulkan. Chichen Itza was a city of international style. It was a melting pot where Maya traditions blended with influences from the Toltec people of central Mexico. The pyramids were shorter and broader, built with a focus on astronomical alignment that bordered on the miraculous. At the center stood the Castillo, the pyramid of Kukulkan. This structure is a stone calendar in 4 dimensions. Each of its 4 stairways has 91 steps, which, when added to the top platform, equals the 365 days of the solar year. But the true magic happened only twice a year, during the equinoxes. As the sun began to set, the shadow of the pyramid's tiers would fall against the side of the northern staircase, creating the rippling image of a giant serpent descending from the heavens to enter the earth. This was Kukulkan, the bringer of civilization, the god of the wind and the stars, coming to bless the people and signal the time for planting or harvest. Thousands would gather in the plaza, watching in breathless silence as the shadow god moved across the stone. A reminder that though the kings might fall, the cosmic order remained perfect. Life in Chichen Itza was also defined by a new, more intense focus on trade and the sea. The Maya had become the Phoenicians of the New World. They built massive cedar canoes, some over 50 feet long, manned by dozens of rowers. These sea merchants circled the entire Yucatan Peninsula, trading salt from the northern flats, honey from the forests, and turquoise from the distant north. They were no longer confined to the jungle. The world was opening up. The marketplace of Chichen Itza was a riot of color and sound. You would hear languages you didn't understand and see goods from thousands of miles away. Gold from the south, copper from the west, and feathers from the deepest jungles. The people of the corn were now the people of the sea, their wealth built on commerce as much as agriculture. But Chichen Itza also held a darker, more mysterious heart, the sacred cenote. This was a massive, yawning limestone sinkhole, its walls sheer and its waters a deep, opaque green. To the people of the city, this was the ultimate portal to the underworld. In times of drought or great need, they did not just offer blood, they offered treasures. They cast into the water bells of gold, carved jade, and fine incense. And sometimes they offered lives. Men, women, and children were sent into the depths to carry messages directly to the gods who lived in the watery dark. While Chichen Itza dominated the plains, other cities found strength in different ways. Along the eastern coast, the city of Tulum sat on a cliff overlooking the turquoise Caribbean Sea. It was a fortress city, surrounded by thick stone walls, acting as a lighthouse and a port for the great trade canoes. Tulum was a city of the sun, where the first light of every day hit the temples before any other place in the Maya world. It was a place of beauty and resilience, a sentinel guarding the eastern gate. As the centuries passed, the dominance of Chichen Itza eventually faded, and the center of power shifted once more, this time to the city of Mayapan. But the era of the superpowers was truly over. The Maya world was becoming more fragmented, a collection of small chiefdoms and provinces. The grand, unified vision of the classic age had been replaced by a more rugged, decentralized survivalism. Yet, even without the holy lords, the culture was more alive than ever. The people still kept the count of the days. They still planted the three sisters. They still spoke the languages of their ancestors. The collapse of the South had taught them that stone is fragile, but the spirit is flexible. They had learned to live with the drought, to trade across the oceans, and to find the divine, not just in the blood of a king, but in the shadow of a serpent on a staircase. As the sun sets over the white stones of the Yucatan, the air is filled with the sound of the sea. The jungle here is shorter, the wind is saltier, and the stars seem closer to the earth. The Maya have found a way to endure. They have moved from the depths of the green forest to the edge of the blue ocean, proving that the people of the corn can adapt to any world, so long as they remember who they are. But even as the cities of the north flourished, a new and unexpected shadow was gathering far across the great water. The Maya had survived the drought, they had survived the wars, and they had survived the fall of their own empires. But they were about to face a challenge for which there was no glyph in their books and no prophecy in their calendars. A world they could not have imagined was coming for them, carried on the wings of white sails. Tonight, listen to the sound of the waves hitting the cliffs of Tulum. It is a rhythmic, patient sound, a reminder that the great cycle is always turning. The new world of the north is at peace for now, but the wind is shifting, and the horizon is no longer empty. The Maya are waiting, their eyes fixed on the rising sun, unaware that the next cycle will be the most difficult one of all. The great cycle of the Maya had turned through millennia of growth, glory, and reinvention. But in the early 16th century, a new and alien rhythm began to beat against the shores of the Yucatan. For centuries, the Maya had looked to the horizon to track the rising of Venus or the journey of the sun. They were unprepared for what appeared on the turquoise waters of the Caribbean in 1511, floating mountains with white wings. This was the arrival of the Spanish, and with them, a clash of civilizations that would be recorded not in stone glyphs, but in blood and iron. To the Maya, these men were a paradox. They were pale as the moon, covered in metal that reflected the sun like the skin of a celestial serpent, and they rode terrifying four-legged beasts that moved with the speed of the wind. They carried sticks of thunder, primitive arquebuses, that could kill from a distance, shattering the traditional protocols of Maya warfare. The first encounters were not of conquest, but of survival. A Spanish shipwreck brought the first two Europeans into the Maya world, Geronimo de Aguilar and Gonzalo Guerrero. Their fates represent the two paths of the coming centuries. Aguilar remained a prisoner, a man of his old world, waiting for rescue. But Guerrero did something unthinkable. He chose the Maya. He tattooed his skin, pierced his ears, married a Maya noblewoman, and became a military advisor to the lords of the Yucatan. When his own countrymen eventually came to rescue him, he refused to leave. He had become one of the people of the corn, a bridge between two worlds that were about to collide with shattering force. In 1519, Hernán Cortés arrived on the island of Cozumel, and the era of the conquistadors began in earnest. The Spanish were driven by a hunger that the Maya could not understand, a hunger for gold. To the Maya, gold was the excrement of the sun, beautiful for jewelry and ritual, but of no practical value compared to jade, salt, or cacao. The Spanish saw the world through the lens of empire and a single, jealous god. The Maya saw a universe of many layers, many cycles, and many deities who required constant negotiation. The conquest of the Yucatan was not a swift victory like the fall of the Aztecs in central Mexico. The Maya were decentralized, a collection of independent provinces rather than a single empire with a single throat to cut. For nearly 20 years, the Spanish, led by Francisco de Montejo, struggled against a guerrilla war that utilized every inch of the thorny, waterless scrub. The Maya used the landscape as a weapon, luring the Spanish into ambushes, poisoning their few water sources, and disappearing into the bush like ghosts. But the Spanish brought an ally more lethal than any steel sword or thunderous gun: the invisible warriors. These were the diseases of the Old World: smallpox, measles, and the flu. The Maya had no immunity to these microscopic invaders. Before the first major battles were even fought, the population was being decimated. It was a silent apocalypse. Imagine a village where the corn stands tall in the fields, but there is no one left to harvest it. The social fabric, the family lineages, and the oral traditions that had been passed down for generations were being severed by a plague that felt like a curse from the gods. Despite the sickness, the Maya resistance was fierce and prolonged. They fought with a desperation born of the realization that this was not just a war for territory, but a war for their very soul. The Spanish sought to erase the old ways. They viewed the sacred books, the bark paper codices filled with the wisdom of the stars, as works of the devil. In 1562, in the town of Mané, Bishop Diego de Landa committed one of history's greatest cultural crimes. He gathered all the Maya books he could find, centuries of history, astronomy, and poetry, and cast them into a massive bonfire. "We found a great number of books," he later wrote, "and as they contained nothing in which were not to be seen as superstition and lies of the devil, we burned them all," which they regretted to an amazing degree, and which caused them much affliction. For the Maya, watching their books burn was like watching their ancestors die a second death. Only 4 of these precious books survived the fires of history, leaving us to piece together their magnificent world from the echoes in stone. Yet, even as the temples were pulled down and the stones were used to build colonial cathedrals, the Maya did not break. They practiced a spiritual camouflage. They accepted the new god and the new saints, but they whispered the names of their old gods behind the altars. They identified the Virgin Mary with the moon goddess, Ixchel, and saw the cross of Christ as a reflection of the world tree, the saber. They moved their rituals from the great plazas into the privacy of their homes and the silence of the caves. The Spanish eventually established their capital at Mérida, built directly over the ruins of the Maya city of To. But the deep jungle remained a sanctuary. In the heart of the Petén, in the very region where the classic Maya had once flourished, a single kingdom held out against the Spanish for almost 200 years. This was Noche Petén, the island capital of the Itza Maya, located in the middle of Lake Petén Itza. The Itza lived as their ancestors had, keeping the count of the days and guarding the ancient prophecies. They believed that they would only be conquered when the great cycle dictated it. For nearly 2 centuries, they turned back Spanish missionaries and soldiers, a defiant island of the old world in a sea of change. It wasn't until 1697 that the Spanish finally launched a naval assault on the island, bringing the last independent Maya kingdom to its knees. The conquest was technically over, but the Maya were not a conquered people. They were a surviving people. They were forced into labor on the great estates, their lives dictated by the chime of the church bell rather than the rising of Venus. But in the evenings, when the Spanish masters were asleep, the old stories were still told. The people of the corn continued to plant their milpas. They continued to grind their maize on the same stone metatates their grandmothers had used. They began to write their history in a new way. Using the Spanish alphabet, they recorded their myths and lineages in books like the Chilam Balam and the Popol Vuh, ensuring that the breath of the saber would not be extinguished. They were no longer the builders of pyramids, but they were the keepers of the flame. As you drift towards sleep tonight, imagine the sound of the rain hitting the thatched roof of a small Maya hut in the 17th century. The world outside has changed beyond recognition. There are strange animals in the fields and strange gods on the hills. But inside the hut, the smell of roasting corn is the same as it was in the days of Tikal. The language is the same. The resilience is the same. The Maya have entered a long, dark night, but they are holding on to the count of the days, waiting for the sun to rise on a new cycle. The great cycle of the Maya does not end with a full stop, but with a comma. We have traveled from the mist-shrouded mountains of creation through the glittering golden noon of the classic kings, witnessed the great thirst, the migration to the northern seas, and the heavy shadow of the conquest. But if you were to walk through the highlands of Guatemala or the flat scrub of the Yucatan today, you would realize that the story of the Maya is not a museum exhibit. It is a living, breathing reality. The stone pyramids may be silent, but the people of the corn are louder than ever. Following the fall of the last independent kingdoms in the 17th century, the Maya entered a period of profound inwardness. To the outside world, they seemed like a defeated peasantry, quiet and subservient on the great henequen plantations and coffee fingers. But beneath the surface, the roots of the saber were still thirsty, and the count of the days was still being kept. In the mountain villages, daykeepers, spiritual guides who had inherited the sacred 260-day Solking calendar, continued to track the character of time. They did not need stone stelae. They kept the dates in their hearts and in the rhythm of their prayers. The 19th and 20th centuries brought new challenges. The Maya were caught in the crossfire of modern politics and civil wars. In the mid-1800s, the Yucatan was set ablaze by the caste war, one of the most successful indigenous uprisings in history. Driven by a talking cross that promised divine protection and the return of their lands, the Maya nearly drove the Spanish-descended elites off the peninsula entirely. They created an independent state that lasted for half a century, a testament to the fact that the warrior spirit of the jaguar had never truly been tamed. In the late 20th century, the Maya of Guatemala endured a silent holocaust during a brutal civil war. Hundreds of villages were destroyed, and hundreds of thousands were displaced. Yet, out of this darkness emerged a global voice. Figures like Rigoberta Menchú brought the struggle of the Maya to the world stage, reminding us that being Maya is not just about a glorious past, but about a right to a future. It was during this era that the world began to look back at the ancient ruins with new eyes. Archaeologists and linguists finally broke the code of the Maya script. For centuries, we thought the glyphs were merely mysterious symbols or simple pictures. But as we learned to read the stone trees, the anonymous ruins suddenly gained names and faces. We learned about Pakal the Great, Jasor Chankawil, and Lady Six Sky. We realized that the Maya were not a lost people who mysteriously vanished. They were a people who survived an ecological and political collapse and simply chose a different way of living. Today, there are more than 7 million Maya people living in Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. They speak over 30 different Maya languages: Quiché, Yucatec, Quiché, and Mam. Languages that share the same grammatical bones as the inscriptions on the ancient temples. When a Maya farmer in the Chiapas jungle speaks to his children today, he is using the same linguistic structure that was used by the scribes of Palenque 1500 years ago. The milpa system, that sacred trinity of corn, beans, and squash, is still the foundation of Maya life. In a world of industrial agriculture and climate change, scientists are now turning to the Maya for wisdom. We are discovering that their forest gardens and their methods of soil conservation are more sustainable than modern techniques. The people of the corn were right all along. The earth is not a resource to be mined, but a living being that requires a blood covenant of care and reciprocity. In the year 2012, the world was gripped by a doomsday fever, believing that the Maya long count calendar predicted the end of the world. But the Maya elders simply smiled. They understood what the modern world had forgotten. Time is a circle, not a line. The end of a Baktun, a 400-year cycle, is not an apocalypse. It is a new fire ceremony. It is a moment to sweep the house, put out the old fires, and light a new one. It is a time for renewal, for reflection, and for starting again. We are currently living in a Maya resurgence. Young Maya artists are using digital tools to create animations of their myths. Musicians are rapping in quiche and tzotzil, blending ancient rhythms with modern beats. Maya architects are looking at the cooling properties of ancient limestone plaster to design sustainable buildings for the future. The people of the corn are no longer hiding in the shadows of the jungle. They are stepping into the light of the 21st century, carrying the wisdom of the stars in one hand and the tools of the modern world in the other. As we conclude this long journey, let us look back one last time at the great saber tree. Its roots are deep in the soil of history, fed by the blood of kings and the sweat of farmers. Its trunk is the present, strong and resilient, weathering the storms of change. And its branches are reaching into the future, into the 13 levels of the heavens. The history of the Maya is a story of balance. It is a warning about what happens when we grow too proud and forget our connection to the earth. but it is also a song of hope about the power of the human spirit to reinvent itself. The temples may be grey today, but in the minds of the 7 million descendants of the corn, they are still painted red. The stone trees are still speaking. The vision serpent is still rising in the smoke of the hearth fires. The Maya did not disappear. They are here. They are us. They are the reminder that we are all people of the corn, dependent on the soil, the rain, and the count of the days. The great cycle continues to turn, and as the sun sets on our story, it is already beginning to rise on the next Bacton. The breath of the saber is still warm, and the heart of the sky is still beating. Oh true, a moment in the jungle. And so, we bring our journey through the world of the Maya to a close. As you drift toward a deep and restorative sleep, imagine yourself standing once more at the base of a great temple in the heart of the Peton. The air is cool, the night is vibrant with the sounds of the jungle, and the stars above are the same stars that the ancient astronomers tracked with such devotion. You are a part of this story now. By listening, you have helped keep the memory of the people of the corn alive. You have walked the white roads, tasted the sacred cacao, and felt the rhythm of the great ball game, the wisdom of the Maya, the understanding that everything is connected, that time is a gift, and that the earth is our mother, is a treasure that you can carry with you into your own dreams. If you found peace or inspiration in this history, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel, History to Relax. It costs you nothing, but it is the lifeblood that allows us to keep exploring these ancient worlds together. Leave a comment below to tell us which part of the Maya story touched you the most, or let us know which civilization you would like to visit next. Now, let the weight of the modern world fall away. Imagine the soft rustle of the maize leaves in a gentle breeze. Feel the cooling mist of the cenote on your skin. The gods are at rest, the kings have found their peace, and the jungle is singing a lullaby of deep time. You are safe, you are held by the earth, and you are part of the great cycle. Sleep now, sleep deeply. Let the breath of the saber guide you into the quietest corners of Xibalba, where only dreams reside. May your rest be as enduring as the stone and as nourishing as the corn. Good night, traveler. Until the sun rises on our next story.